And mine says recording. So, welcome to this session of the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Center Partnership Seminar Series for 2023. My name is Aaron. I'm from the School of Business and Creative Industries and also Indigenous and Transcultural Research Center. I'm one of the three leads. I look at the area of capability development, and very honored today to have Bertha Chin join us from Swinburne University in Malaysia. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous leaders on the lands in which we meet, past, present, emerging, and understanding that this land and this area of knowledge creation will continue to be an area that shows us impact and legacy in our own research and beyond. So I'll do a short introduction to Bertha, and then we'll hear from her. So Bertha is a senior lecturer in the area of media and communication at Swinburne University of Technology in Sarawak, and has published extensively in areas of transcultural fandom, fan labor, subcultural celebrity, anti-fandom, and fan-producer relationships. She is currently researching the intersections of Hollywood media representations of East and Southeast Asians, transcultural fandoms, and celebrity cultures. Bertha is the co-editor of Crowdfunding the Future, Media Industries, Ethics and Digital Society, and Eating Fandom, a recent publication from Routledge. She's also one quarter or one fourth of the editorial team for the journal Popular Communication. So over to you, Bertha, on your fascinating topic.
All right. Thank you, Aaron, first of all, for inviting me to give this talk. And I think it's really interesting because I never realized that there's a research center which is focused on Indigenous and transcultural research. So let me just share my slides before I get ahead of myself. Okay. So I thought what I'll do today is basically give you an introduction to fan studies, which is the bulk of my research, but it was also my PhD research, which I did in Cardiff University in the UK. And this concept called transcultural fandom, which I co-wrote a paper with Laurie Morimoto, which came out in 2013. And I think we underestimated the kind of impact that it had. Because I now get kind of random people coming up to me and saying, you know, this is something which is really useful. And I'll talk a little bit more about where I think where I was coming from when I was thinking about these terms, and how kind of Laurie and I wanted to kind of diversify the field a little bit. So I'll start off with, I think, you know, kind of an attempt at defining what a fan is. And one of the things that fan scholars tend to be very bad at is we don't really define what a fan is. And this is the closest that I can get. So Matt Hills, who wrote a book called Fan Cultures in 2002, started the book by saying that everybody knows what a fan is. It's somebody who is obsessed with a particular star, celebrity, film, TV program, band, somebody who can produce reams of information on their object of fandom. And I think the second part of this quote is probably something which frame a lot of the research that informs a lot of us, is that fans participate in a lot of communal activities. So I myself am a fan, and this is the reason that my recent obsession is this game adaptation called Last of Us, which is why I try to insert it in all of the slides that I try to do whenever I talk about fandom. This sort of communal activities is something that frames a lot of the early research into fan studies. And just a bit of introduction. Fan studies is a study of a niche group of media audiences, and it's popularized, you know, kind of often credited to Henry Jenkins, who wrote Textual Poachers and came out in 1993. It's sort of, you know, even though it's often credited as the starting point of fan studies, the interest in engaged audiences kind of goes a bit further back. So you find bits and pieces of work that was done in literary studies, for example, but also kind of cultural studies tradition, which is also the tradition that I came from. So works by Dick Hebditch, who, you know, kind of did a very, very in-depth study of subcultures and how it's related to fashion, for example. And he did this book was published in 1979. and was something that was really influential for a lot of cultural studies scholars when I started kind of picking up cultural studies. But also, a lot of our work is, of course, framed by Stuart Hall's approach to encoding and decoding on how media audiences actually look at the media that they consume. But what Jenkins did was he focused on film and television, but in particular, cult media. So he was looking at fans of Star Trek, the 1960s original Star Trek, and Star Wars. And at the time, he was, looking at people who was recording episodes on, directly from the television on VHS tapes, and they were sharing this around. They were going to conventions physically, meeting up as kind of fan clubs, unofficial fan clubs every week, depending on where they were staying. So it was very much sort of geography based, location based as well. And Jenkins argued that a lot of these texts that this niche group of audiences were very much sort of attached to kind of resonate very culturally. And so you get a very different set of practices that you would normally find from, kind of audiences who maybe just make sure that they will be in front of the television. So we're talking about the 80s and the 90s here in this case. At the time, would make sure that they're in front of the television at a specific time just to watch something. But these group of audiences went further. So what they would do is the things that he discovered was that they would watch and rewatch these media texts to the point where they will try and find out a lot of information. And this goes also kind of beyond just what happens in the subtext, but also how the industry actually works. And they will also, again, sort of coming from Stuart Hall's kind of tradition, they often reject a lot of the readings which is imposed on them by the media industry. So there's something about resistance towards this kind of big conglomerates, big kind of multinational companies here, which were obviously kind of the studios and the production companies who are behind all these kind of culturally important media texts. So the fans actually do this by what Jenkins called poaching. So he uses a lot of terms, work that was done by Michel Decerteau, who talked about how we write on the margins of the text that we are reading. And the fans will do this not just by writing, but by actually creating their own cultural products. So mashing together characters from different media texts and creating, often new universes for them to kind of have narratives in. All this is done concurrently with the text that they're viewing. So there's all these very, very active, creative things that are being done alongside them watching and rewatching this media text. And something that he found that they did as well was they really discriminate very fiercely between sort of who they are and who they aren't, and who is and isn't in their communities. So people who may not necessarily like the same text as they do or read the text the same way as they do will often be ostracized in a way, or kind of excluded out of these kind of practices. So this was sort of the beginnings of fan studies. And then I guess you've sort of fast forward to 2007, where a lot more people started to become aware of what fan studies is. Was that Jonathan Gray, Cornell Sandvoss, and C. Lee Harrington talked about how when they were writing this in 2007, that because of Jenkins' textual approaches, they have identified 3 wave or 3 generation of fan scholars. And a lot of these were done within sort of School of Literary Studies, Media Studies, Cultural Studies as well, particularly in America and the UK. So they identified the first phase as being fandom is beautiful. So the study of fandom is considered something which is a worthy cause. So every time you do something like this, there's almost always a rationale that this is something worthy, because fans aren't just cultural dupes. They actually do find meaning in the things that they consume. They discriminate, and they're much more critical of the text that they're consuming than your general kind of consumer in a sense. So this first group of people will draw very, very heavily on the work of Michel de Certeau. So John Fisk would often kind of say fans are associated with cultural tastes, of subordinate formations of people. So particularly those disempowered by any combination of gender, age, class, and race. So a lot of the studies done within this first wave looked at fans as being disadvantaged to a certain extent. So they might be, and a lot of them are women who, may be cut off from certain aspects of career. For example, a lot of them are homemakers, for example. That tends to be the demographics of the sort of first wave of fan studies, who are looking for, kind of social groups outside of their homes, for example. So the focus almost always tends to be focused, the research tends to be focused on these group of people. And then you move on to the second wave of the second generation of fan scholarship, which is where we started to inject a lot more ideas about social hierarchy. So this is where fan scholars start drawing on works of sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And this wave sort of highlighted this sort of this replication of social and cultural hierarchies within fan and subcultures. So as a choice for fan objects and practices of fan consumption, they're structured through all these sort of habitus and cultural productions that was identified by Bourdieu. And this is sort of manifested in the communities that fans have formed. And now sort of starting to kind of get to the age where the internet becomes a bit more accessible in a sense. So which of course then moves us to the third wave, which we still sort of currently are, and we start looking at fans as part of this kind of modernity, as part of this modernity. So it's moving beyond the sort of two waves and their particular discourse on fan communities, but also then start to take into consideration the sort of technological developments of the internet, social media, but also the entertainment industry was changing as well with streaming platforms and all of those things. But also kind of the growing visibility of fan cultures as a global phenomenon. So media representation starts to become a bit more important. And then particularly now, I think it's very, very difficult, at least within kind of media studies, at least, to avoid the impact that K-pop or the Korean wave in general has on global audiences in a sense. So this is sort of where we are right now. So I was part of the second wave of fan studies. So I use Bourdieu a lot in my work, and sort of this is also kind of where I was approaching this idea of how do you then make this kind of field of research a bit more inclusive, but a bit more diverse as well, to kind of reflect the things that I myself was seeing on the internet at the time. But this is also, again, sort of informed by the things that I was seeing that, kind of fans were producing. So as an example, the two things that I've shared here is, this is from an Instagram account of what we call a fan artist. So it's an artist who does a lot of work, but very much sort of involving kind of characters from popular media texts. And this is The Witcher and the Game of Thrones characters as anime characters. And we see this a lot. That's kind of coming through in a lot of spaces where fans would inhabit. But what wasn't happening was the academic side of things. The academic side of things was, of course, it was very much kind of originating from American tradition. So a lot of work was still being done on English language, but also kind of Anglo-centric observations about what fans were doing. And so it does not afford a different type of perspective. It does not, kind of even afford things like post-colonialism, for example, because it wasn't something that people were probably thinking about. But also kind of, different types of media texts as well. So for example, the Korean wave that I was talking about, But also then, kind of different celebrities, different idols, also kind of celebrities who now are very comfortable maybe with dual language, for example, those sort of things. This was sort of all happening on the media landscape, but also kind of fans were injecting, all these kind of different their own culture into the images that they were seeing on screen. And one of the things that I was kind of frustrated by with the field was that it doesn't account for the very messy and complex transnational sort of media flows. I grew up in Sarawak, and I had a very English education, but I grew up in Sarawak, and I was very very used to um, getting media from Hollywood, but also getting media from India. Kind of Bollywood, long 3-hour Bollywood films was something that a lot of people my age grew up watching on television because they just wasn't something, that was the only thing that was available on television, and we would watch it coming home from school. And then the television and switching to Hong Kong, Cantonese dramas at 6 o'clock every day in Malaysia, and that was our kind of childhood growing up. But it also kind of gave us the same kind of access to things like Disney and a lot of kind of Hollywood A-list blockbusters. And this was sort of what growing up in Malaysia was like. And I imagine, and having conversations with a lot of people, um, growing up in Southeast Asia was essentially the same thing. Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, you would get media which is in your own language or your national language, but you would also get media from any amount of kind of, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, as well as kind of English language. But we even got telenovelas, which was screened in Spanish with Malay subtitles. And then eventually these kind of ended up getting dubbed into Malay. So this was the kind of media environment that I was growing up in, but I wasn't seeing this being replicated in the academic works on fandom and also on audiences or fans who came from similar backgrounds, like myself. So essentially we were sort of absent in a way. So that's just sort of where I was coming from in when I started thinking about transcultural fandom. And then I met Lori Morimoto when she was also doing her PhD. And she is American, but she grew up, she calls herself, she identifies as a third culture kid. So she grew up in Japan and in Hong Kong. And when Zoni introduced to a lot of the big American texts when she was in Japan, um, and then when she was in Hong Kong, she was introduced to Japanese media. So there was all these kind of things that was happening, and we didn't see this being replicated in the, that sort of the academic works that we were seeing being published. So we came up with this term, and our attempt at defining what transcultural fandom is that this idea that fans become fans of border crossing texts or objects, not necessarily because of where they are produced, because a lot of time when we were doing this, there was a lot of work that was suggesting that the Korean wave was really popular with Asian audiences because of a cultural proximity. But the things that we were seeing, and obviously my own experience was saying that that's not necessarily the case. So we wanted to kind of provide a different perspective by suggesting that, things like this, people can become fans of objects or celebrities or, kind of any media text, regardless of where they are produced, but because they may recognize the sort of very subjective moment of affinity. So it could be the way a character looks. It could be something that they said. It could be the kinds of characteristics that they project. So it's much more than where it's produced, in a sense. So it is one of a so where a particular media text is produced is just one of a constellation of possible points of affinity for somebody to become a fan of something. So this was our definition of transcultural fandom when we first wrote about this back in 2013. Why did we use that term transcultural rather than transnational? Because that was mostly the term that was being used at the time. One of which was because we wanted to critique what Koichi Iwabuchi was doing, because he was looking at obviously a lot of pan East Asian media circulation and consumption. And he was talking about how when these texts tend to circulate across the sort of pan Asia, they lose its cultural order, is what is the term that he uses. So Japan would be sort of marketing its media products across Asia, but tamming down the kind of Japaneseness of a particular product. So they lose the identity of sorts as a way of making it, kind of sellable to kind of worldwide audiences in a sense. But the things that we were seeing among fans was that it was often the Japaneseness of a particular product that made them more alluring to fans. And it made them perhaps, to want to learn about that particular culture, to want to take up a language, for example, to learn about, what kinds of foods that they were having, as what is being witnessed by the sort of the Korean wave currently. So we wanted to kind of look at, kind of, or offer an alternative to kind of Iwabuchi's critique of this sort of pan East Asian media circulation and consumption. But I also found when talking to a lot of people, I was based in the UK at the time when we developed this, and I was coming back and I was talking to people about my PhD and working on fan studies. And a lot of the reaction that I got was, why are you doing something which is very, very white and Western? You should be doing something which is more serious. And that was a lot of the reaction that I was getting throughout my PhD and even now. So it felt like there was a notion of shame that surrounds fans, but also kind of people who are working within sort of fan studies in a sense. So the sort of identity and practices of fan studies scholars, but also the fans, becomes very, very messy in a sense. So the kind of the East Asian kind of fan phenomena is assumed to kind of depoliticize the sort of very critical cultural studies in a sense. I still get that today, the sort of pushback to say, this is something that people will grow out of, and this is not something, it's just, people who like something and they should have grown out of it in a way, not really seeing the kind of the possibilities that you can learn from their consumption habits, but also from the kind of the identities that kind of come up. And we also kind of want to move away from, I think, the baggage of the national in a sense. So the focus, a lot of studies was kind of focused on transnationalism at the time. And I wanted to take a lot more kind of a cultural perspective on these things that we were looking at. So while it's important, it doesn't tell us anything, or it doesn't tell us everything about what attracts and motivates fans to a particular text, for example. But also using this term allows us a space to recognize hybridity, because a lot of my own identity is very, very hybridized, it's very diasporic, it's also very hybridized. It takes into consideration the sort of complexities of cultural identities, which is now not only brought on by globalization, but also by travel, by migration, by the sort of the diaspora, and in a sense, and in this sort of interactions. So before, when fan studies was being established, a lot of these kind of observations were being done within what we would call communities. On a practical level, of course, this was much easier to research because it means being able to go to a community with its very strict boundaries and looking at what fans were doing. But as a lot of these kind of practices move online, that boundary of where a community that ends and begins starts to become a bit more porous. So Laurie started saying, we're not really looking at communities in the sense that it was traditionally kind of Benedict Anderson style communities. We're now looking very likely at what Pratt was calling kind of contact zones, because a lot of these spaces, online spaces, are being shared across different cultures, which means you have very, very different understanding of what is acceptable. And what may not be acceptable. So certain things, trigger warnings, for example, certain cultures may not necessarily understand what constitutes as a trigger warning. Certain cultures may not necessarily understand about things like copyright and intellectual property. Or they, not to say that they don't understand, but they may have different practices surrounding all these kind of ideas. So there's always potential for all these interactions to end up in conflict. So rather than, and this kind of goes against this idea of community in a way. So we suggested kind of thinking about fandoms as contact zones rather than just kind of merely as communities. So there are social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in context of highly asymmetrical relations of power. So it kind of enables the possibility of fandoms coming from this diversity of cultures, often kind of meshing together in this one space. Races, genders, nations, sexualities, abilities, ages, for example, they all come together. Conflict may happen, they may clash, they may move away, they may kind of, start kind of other platforms or move to other platforms because of this. But we need to recognize the sort of, that's part of, again, that sort of messiness of hybrid cultures in a way. So I guess it brings me then to this sort of statement to say that transcultural fandom as a kind of a potential intervention within fan studies, within a very, very culturally white and structurally white institution, that transcultural fandom is a potential intervention. But we're kind of, again, sort of now wondering, is this something which is relevant in the context of globalized fandoms, for example, or is this useful in thinking about, kind of where we are currently, where streaming platforms is making kind of consumption a bit more complex. The internet, obviously, and social media platforms is also making kind of consumption habits a bit more complex. And identities, of course, is always something which is fascinating, but complex. So I guess what we're then trying to do is to kind of suggest that transcultural fandom affords us this possibility of investigating that in-betweenness and multiplicities within all these kind of different transcultural fandoms. It enables questions such as how fan communities are constructed, but also something which I am quite invested in is who gets a voice and who doesn't. This is something that I always kind of, I'm always trying to kind of answer or try to get at, and who gets included, who gets left out when we start talking about fandom, or when we start talking about all these kind of various different transculturalism. And I think this also then allows for this intervention of post-colonial and indigenous studies to start to come in, as well as studies on diaspora to look at something which is, kind of traditionally, as I said, kind of structurally white. And I think it's especially relevant when streaming and social media platforms are making text more accessible, more cross collaboration. There's more reboots now when we think about kind of the media industry, a lot more remakes, especially if you're looking at sort of the Hollywood machine. And there's kind of possibilities to establish franchises and properties being discovered and rediscovered across sort of different cultures. So I use one example is the one that I have here on the slide is something that Studio Ghibli and Lucasfilm did last year as a response to the popularity of Baby Yoda from The Mandalorian, which is part of the Star Wars universe. And they, they kind of gave it a Japanese anime, but a Studio Ghibli anime look. And this was released as a short film on Disney Plus last year, and it attracted both sides of both franchises of the fans, and it actually introduced Star Wars fans to Studio Ghibli and likewise as well. So there's now all these kind of possibilities with all these things sort of happening, and I think with that's sort of where this idea of transcultural fandom can then come in, because you're looking at consumption which is happening across different cultures. You're looking at people being introduced to, all these different cultures that they have never even considered before in their own kind of media consumption. I've got a lot of friends right now on a kind of vernacular will come and tell me they've never realized how interesting Korean food is until they discovered K-pop and started watching K-dramas, and all they want to do now is go to Korea and eat Korean food. But that's sort of what is made possible through fandom, the sort of discoveries, but the sort of discussions as well. But of course, that's the positive side. There's also the sort of the negative and the complex side of things as well. And I think I'll end it there, because I probably would like to hear maybe your thoughts and questions a bit more for discussions rather than just me talking all the time. So thank you.
Thank you, Bertha. Thanks for your insights. It's a fascinating world. Often we see it from our own four edges of the TV and don't often think too much about this. But I wanted to open the time to the floor. If any of you've got some questions you wanted to ask and pose to Bertha. Just go for it, Anne.
You muted, I think.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't know if it's so much as a question, but maybe just an experience that I'd be interested to hear Bertha speak to. I taught Japanese here for 20 years, and in that time, it was remarkable to observe the motivations of students learning Japanese shift very, very much to this absolutely obsessive love for anime, J-pop, those sorts of things. And on the upside, as a language teacher, they had beautiful pronunciation and intonation. They really kind of absorbed the level of the language, and they also had a great vocabulary that they sort of acquired from watching anime. But what took a little bit of convincing sometimes was to get them to understand that not everybody in Japan speaks like an anime character. So there was a specific kind of genre of language that they needed to expand beyond. And also sometimes when we'd organise like sort of conversation classes with Japanese students studying on campus, often they would just want to talk obsessively about their interest in this particular anime. These young people going, whoa, I've got no interest in that. And the Japanese term otaku is like obsessive, it's kind of social skills to talk about other things when you'd often hear them sort of talking about the Japanese students talking together. So I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to speak to.
Kind of from personal experience, I am learning Spanish because I enjoy watching. So this is an example. Like I am learning Spanish because I enjoy watching, kind of a lot of the Spanish horror films. But again, my interest in learning Spanish came because I loved the series Narcos. And this is, again, it's not a representation of the entire Latin America, but I think it's a fine line, I think, to kind of maneuver in a way. And of course, the people that we're studying, the fans that we are studying, are obviously a lot more immersed in the cultures in a very different way. A lot of times where you look at kind of fan studies, a lot of the research that's been done within fan studies tend to focus on people who have done produced things. So things like art, for example, or fiction. And that's the creative products that fans would sort of come up with. Some of them will go on to kind of build, depending on, because I look a lot at cult media. So a lot of people will start building things. So the robots that they see on Doctor Who, for example, they will kind of try and rebuild that in as close as possible to the origin that they can see. And a lot of them then do go on to become part of the industry from the skills that they have gained. So fan studies kind of tend to kind of look at across the people who are doing this sort of thing. So kind of more productive fandom in a way. And then of course you get the people who are then looking at it as a sort of, this is all very exotic and we want to learn so much about it, and all they want to talk about is anime, for example. And so it's a fine line, I think, to kind of kind of balance it out in a way. Often, and it's a really good point. We don't get a lot of studies which will look at people who will then go on and immerse themselves in this culture, because then you start thinking about when is it cultural appropriation and when is it sort of kind of a genuine interest to interact with that particular culture, in a sense. And just certainly really interesting in a sense, something to really think about. But also a lot of, I think, for what it's worth, fan studies at its current sort of incarnation isn't really ready to deal with these sort of complexities or the sort of messiness in cross-cultural relations, because again, a lot of it is still in its infancy. And as I said, my current sort of fascination is with who gets left out of this conversation, because even as I was training to be, when I was doing my PhD, a lot of assumption was, oh, you were just doing research on English speaking, very much sort of Western based fans. And part of that problem was that whenever I tried to speak to somebody who are based in Asia, either they don't want to admit to being a fan, or they just don't want to talk to you about it. So on a practical level, there is that kind of inability yet to be able to kind of look at this, potential of kind of cultural appropriation, but then the potential of that sort of complexities. I was, just to give you another example of how difficult sometimes it is to kind of get people to talk to me. I was co-editing a special issue journal for Plaridel, which is a Philippines journal. It's a journal of communication, which is based in the Philippines. And I was co-editing this with a friend of mine who works in Thailand, and her specialty is on fan tourism, and film tourism in particular. So we wanted to kind of gather together scholars within Southeast Asia, so not East Asia, but in Southeast Asia, who were looking at pop culture, who are looking at, kind of fan studies adjacent. So people who were interested in pop culture, but then they were also looking at fans, for example. It ended up taking 3 years to get people to commit. It took us, we thought that it would take us a year to get people to, write something for us. It took us 3 years to get that special issue published, not because there were delays with manuscripts or anything. It was because we couldn't get anyone to want to be associated with doing things on pop culture. And even till today, I have people coming up to me and saying, "You're very brave in doing this, looking the way that you are." Like, I don't know whether to say thank you or be insulted. So I think, kind of in a sense, the field isn't really equipped to think about this, but also kind of a lot of it is, again, sort of institutionalized as well. The institutions that we work in may not necessarily afford us to be very open about doing research into pop culture, for example. I find that a lot in Asia. And that's my experience. So I don't know whether that sort of answers your question. Sorry, I went on a tangent there.
No, that's great. It's a very interesting background. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Anne. Anyone else has a comment or question? Yes, Catherine.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bertha. It was a fascinating presentation. I too like the term transcultural, as Maria knows, and Aaron, and rather than transnational. But as you were speaking and some of the examples, I was thinking about the notion of translanguaging as well, and whether fans end up producing a kind of translanguage text or, form of communication. I don't know. Just fascinated by the trans in all of it, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a huge body of work in translation studies, which sort of touch on, and again, this is kind of one of the problems with academic fields, is that we tend to silo ourselves into our own little kind of community at the end of the day, and sometimes we may not realize that actually translation studies is actually doing a lot of work into translation. And I know for a fact that for a lot of animes, for example, fans, so diaspora fans, Japanese diaspora who are based in the States, for example, or in the UK, or English-speaking countries, I would say, would perform that particular labor to translate a lot of the anime and the manga into English for their friends, for example. A lot of this is done without kind of obviously the sanction of the industry. As I understand it, the certain parts of the manga community is now sanctioning it. So they have industry backing to kind of not paid. So it's still free labor to a certain extent. But it's now with the approval. So a lot of these translators, and these are fan translators who will work very, very closely with the artists and the anime and the manga writers to actually do perform the translation. But then it brings up other problems like labor, for example, because they're not officially recognized by the industry, even though they're sanctioned by the industry in a way. So yeah, that's a very interesting, that kind of trans language sort of fandom. I see a lot more of it now with the popularity of Chinese dramas, which is now being screened on Netflix, which means that it's opening up a lot of all these kind of Chinese dramas to a whole new kind of level of audience, which is sometimes met with not very enthusiasm, not a lot of enthusiasm, because I hear one of my PhD students is Chinese, and she's like, there's a lot of dissatisfaction among the Chinese audiences that this is something which is inherently theirs, and it's being screened on a global sort of platform. It's a platform that they can't get access to. And then other people are kind of other cultures are having a go at, or misunderstanding their culture, because there's a particular kind of Chinese dramas that's being screened on Netflix. So again, it goes back to the sort of tension and the conflict that can occur because of all these, kind of politics and geopolitics as well that's going on.
Yes, yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Catherine.
I don't have a question, Bertha, but it was fascinating. Very fascinating. And I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to present with us this afternoon. That was just awesome. And thanks for sharing your journey about the experiences and resistance, I guess, that you had from others around you, and being transparent about that, because that's something that we don't hear or know about. And I just think in research we should talk more about those types of things. Thank you.
Thanks, Bertha. Yeah. So I just wanted to check also on some of the areas that you've briefly mentioned. I know you talked about transcultural fandom and the concepts and the theories behind it. I wonder some of the methods that you would apply, because clearly finding interviews or surveys to do it would be somewhat of a stretch. And I know this is kind of like the skeleton in the room now, where people are saying, AI and this kind of tools because they can generate artwork and artifacts of cultural things and objects from different countries and present that to the world. And I wonder, are we going too fast in that space to conduct research based on those things that's been produced?
No, that's a really great question in a sense. I know a lot of fans are pushing back against generative AI, mostly because they understand the fact that these works that which are being produced, they are specific archives and websites that fans will share their work to. A lot of the art is shared on Tumblr, for example, and a lot of the fiction that they write is on a website called Archive of Our Own, which if you're familiar with kind of Chinese politics, it's been banned recently, I think last year, or was it a couple of years ago now, because by the Chinese government, because it's been accused of propagating a particular kind of, well, it's been accused of propagating a particular kind of leftist politics, but also kind of, again, sort of LGBTQ plus friendly politics. And these archives are obviously, public, because the objective of the fan when they produce something is to share it with their fellow kind of fans. So I've been seeing a lot of pushback and criticism about generative AI because they know and they're very much aware that what these AIs are doing is basically kind of scraping their information and their data and the content. And if this kind of pieces of fiction, pieces of artwork is being shared for free, to the public, they know and they're aware that it is their work, which is being scraped for information to produce and reproduce. I think on a personal level, I think it's still early stage to see the impact of AI on fan cultures, but I do know that a lot of these fan producers are locking up their creative works. So they're now making it, if on Tumblr, for example, they will say, if you want to read more, if you want to see more, you have to send me an email or you ask me to tag you, and then it'll be available. So you have to be logged in all the time. Archive of Our Own introduced so before you could read anything without needing an account. And so now they've made it available that you can sign up for an account and the authors would have a right to actually make that particular piece of fiction locked, so or private in a way. So you need to have an account before you can even read the story. So I think kind of these archives, Archive of Our Own is actually fan run. And it's run by volunteers, basically. So they're very much aware of what's happening and the debates that's happening and discourse as well. So they are very, they will try to respond to fans' concerns. But when you get third-party kind of applications like Tumblr, for example, it gets more complicated because, again, this is something that I think a lot of fans are discussing as well with Elon Musk taking over at Twitter, and now kind of with everything that's going on, a lot of people are concerned that the K-pop fans in particular, because a lot of their activities and their practices are very much on that particular platform, and they are extremely aware that whatever Musk decides to do with the platform, it is going to affect them. It's going to affect the algorithm that they have worked very, very hard to try and master, to get BTS onto all these American Music Awards or all these, and they're very aware of all these kind of algorithms and how it works. And now they're discussing the impact of Musk and what he will have on their fandom, because it's making it so much harder to kind of read all these things now. So I think it's early days to see the impact, but fans are they're very, very aware of the discourse that's happening, and they're definitely pushing back against AI.
Thank you, Bertha. Looking if anyone's other points, but it was great to hear from you, and thank you again from the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Center. Potentially, if you're interested, showcase us some of the things that you're working on. We've got a blog, we've got newsletters that go out, and certainly when the opportunity arises, I think there'll be some of us here and many others listening in to work on collaborative projects as well into the regions and certainly in Malaysia, where we've got many research partners as well. So thank you all once again for your time this afternoon, and thank you, Bertha, for sharing, and we look forward to communicating more with you in some of these fascinating areas.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Bertha.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.